This is Debt Free in 30, where every week we take 30 minutes and get practical advice from industry experts about personal finance and living debt-free. Here's your host, Doug Hoyes.
A few weeks ago, I got a phone call from Rebecca Martin, and she told me that in the past week, she had received 4 calls from people who used to live in Canada, and now they live in the U.S., and they have Canadian debts that they can't pay, and they want to know what are their options. Rebecca and I talked about the exact opposite issue back on episode number 123, which aired in January 2017. That show was about what happens if you live in Canada but have U.S. debts. I'll put a link to that episode in the show notes over at hoyes.com. So if we're getting calls about it, it must be an issue. So today we'll get some practical advice on how to deal with Canadian debt if you live outside of Canada. Can you just default on it? Ignore it? Or do you need to go bankrupt? That's our topic today. Rebecca Martin, welcome back. Since it's been over a year and a half since you've been on the show, please tell the listeners what Hoyes Michaelis office you run and how long you've been with us.
I run the Windsor office, and I just celebrated my 15th anniversary with Hoyes Michaelis.
15 years with Hoyes Michaelis. So there you go. Rebecca's been doing this a while. She knows what she's talking about. So this issue of Canadian and U.S. debt is something that you see frequently because, of course, Windsor is a border city just across the river from Detroit. Did I say Detroit right there?
Yes, you did.
It's not Detroit. So, I mean, you can literally stand in downtown Windsor and see the skyline over the Detroit River, see the skyline of downtown Detroit. So I assume it's very common or not unusual for you to see people who either work in Canada or the U.S. while living in the other country. So that's a common thing you see?
Yeah, it's quite common. There's 2 things that happen. Either the person lives in Windsor, works in the U.S., and inevitably what can happen is you meet someone who lives in the U.S., you decide then to pull up states in Canada and just settle in Detroit or someplace outside of Detroit. Excellent.
So let's go through a bunch of questions here, and you can tell us how to deal with debt when you're in that situation. So let's say I'm a Canadian. I've incurred some debt in Canada, credit cards, bank loans, whatever, and now I live in the United States. So, I mean, the obvious option in my mind is I just ignore it. So if I ignore it, what will happen? So how easy is it for a Canadian creditor, a Canadian bank, for example, to collect money from me if I live in the United States?
It's not easy. I mean, they can call you, they can harass you, but what they have to do is they have to sue you in Canada, and then they have to bring that lawsuit over to the U.S. and then get the U.S. court to certify that lawsuit, and at that point, then they can pursue you. So yes, it can be done, but it's expensive, so it's not something that I see very often. In fact, I've only seen it once.
Okay, so very unusual to do that. It's very easy to sue someone in Canada if you're in Canada, because if I'm the big bank, I've got a lawyer who goes to that court in Windsor, every 2 days, so suing people is easy. But
right. To
go to Michigan or Delaware, wherever the person's living, completely different situation. So, okay, ignoring it means they might sue me, but you say that's a very unusual circumstance. How is that going to affect my credit report?
It won't. There's no cross-border reporting between Equifax Canada and Equifax US.
So my Canadian debts are on my Canadian Equifax or TransUnion report. My U.S. debts are on, in effect, a completely separate report.
That's correct.
Even though it still says Equifax or TransUnion, there's no cross-merging of it. So, and I believe I did a show on that last year about some guys who are using blockchain to coordinate credit so that it'll actually be something that becomes a worldwide thing. But at the moment, that's not the case. So if I was to just ignore my debts, so I'm a Canadian now living in the U.S., I could just ignore them, and it's not going to show up on my Canadian, it'll show up on my Canadian credit report, but I'm not living there anymore.
Right.
So I guess a big part of it is, am I coming back or not?
Right. Well, part of it is you're coming back, and I think the other part is most people don't just want to ignore it. They want to deal with it somehow. Because even though it's going to be hard to sue them, they're still going to call you. So what do you have to do to get those maybe 5 or 6 phone calls a day, which does happen, those 5 or 6 phone calls a day stopped?
Yeah, and anybody who has debts in Canada knows that. If you don't pay, then the robo-dialer is calling you every hour, every 2 hours. If you don't pick up, it just calls you again. So, okay, so if I just ignore it, if I'm going to live in the U.S. for an extended period of time, I'm not going to be able to get credit in Canada because I guess my credit report in Canada is going to look lousy. But I am still going to be getting phone calls if they know my U.S. phone number, I guess, if I brought my cell phone with me or if they can track me down. So there is certainly the nuisance factor. And obviously, if I ever plan to come back to Canada, if I've ignored my Canadian debts, well, by the time I come back to Canada,
they're waiting for you.
Yeah, it's going to be a mess. So if I'm going to be away for a long time, the Limitations Act in Ontario says you have to sue someone within 2 years of when they stop paying. So if I'm going to be gone for a long time and they don't sue me before I get back, I guess they're not going to be able to get a judgment against me when I get back, but my credit report's going to look lousy.
Right. Well, and the issue too is even though it's been 2 years, they serve the notice on you, they're suing you. You don't defend yourself. They're still going to get judgment against you. So you have to be able to come back, file that statement of defense saying it's been over 2 years. So it can be done, but it's still a lot of work.
Yeah, valid point. So what you're saying is, well, okay, let's take the scenario then I actually want to deal with it then. I don't want to just put my head in the sand. I may be coming back to Canada, or I just like to deal with it. I don't want to deal with phone calls, anything like that. So what are my options then?
So your options are essentially the same as if you were living in Canada. You can deal with a credit counselor to try to file a debt management plan, which can be done online. You can just try to negotiate with the creditors on your own. So you might have a certain amount of money stashed aside in the U.S. that you're able to settle your debts for so many cents on the dollar. There's some logistical issues, but you can still do bankruptcy. You can still do a consumer proposal.
Okay, so let's talk about the bankruptcy and the consumer proposal then. So what does the law say about who can file a bankruptcy in Canada?
The wording states you have to have resided for the past year in Canada, or carry on business in Canada, or where your locality is considered where your assets are.
So reside or carry on business in Canada.
Correct.
Within the last year. So if I've lived in the United States for 3 years, I would not necessarily be eligible to file a bankruptcy in Canada today.
True, but then you go to that second part where you have assets located. So if you live in Ohio, let's say, but you still have a Windsor address, maybe for mailing purposes, maybe you have something in storage, technically you are still allowed to file, and the Office of the Superintendent of Bankruptcy has been allowing it.
Okay. So if I want, let's go through that then. So I decide, you know what, I want to file bankruptcy or a consumer proposal, either one in that scenario. So if I have a post office box, or maybe my mother still lives here and I come and visit her 3 times a month, and I've been using her address for years, living at her house or whatever, then I could still legally file a bankruptcy or consumer proposal.
Yeah, absolutely.
And when you do a bankruptcy filing, you've got to put the person's address on it.
Right.
That gets sent into the system. It has to be a Canadian address.
Right.
So that's really the key then. I
have
to have a Canadian address that I can put on the paperwork. So assuming I can do that, then I'm good to go. Now, whether you should actually file a bankruptcy or consumer proposal, that's not the topic for this show. In fact, let's talk about that, because I know what the rules are. I'm a licensed insolvency trustee. So are you. The rule is before you can file a bankruptcy or consumer proposal, you have to meet in person with a licensed insolvency trustee to be assessed.
Right.
How can I do that if I'm in the United States?
You drive.
You come here.
Yeah, you come here. It's easy as that. And the people that I see mostly are within an easy driving distance. Michigan, well, like you said, it's 5 minutes away from the office. Ohio is only an hour away. So the most recent person I met, she actually was from Ohio. She had lived in Windsor. Back in 2009, she got a job in the U.S., met her partner, decided to get married, pulled up stakes in Windsor, moved to Ohio. Been working in Ohio. Everything's going great. About 6 months ago, she lost her job. She hasn't been able to find another one. Creditor calls are overwhelming. And that was one of the 4 people that contacted me that week, which led to this podcast. She calls up, what can I do? Go through all the options. We talked on the phone for quite a while. She was coming to Windsor anyway. So we met in person. She decided to file for bankruptcy.
So get in your car, get on an airplane, whatever it is, come to see you. So you have to come and meet with you to be assessed, and then obviously to file the paperwork.
Right.
We all know that there are 2 credit counseling sessions, what are now called BIA, Bankruptcy and Insolvency Act counseling sessions, that are part of the process, whether it's a bankruptcy or a consumer proposal. And those are traditionally done in person as well.
Correct.
So, and then there could also be other requirements. There could be a creditors meeting, for example. That's a highly unusual circumstance in a proposal, but it could happen. There could be a discharge hearing. So there may be other occasions where you need to return to Canada to deal with those in-person meetings.
So as long as the person's prepared to commit to having to come back whenever is needed, then it's not an issue.
And so is that a common thing? Like, do you see, I mean, obviously this particular person you're talking about was a very recent case. Is it something you would encounter 1 or 2 times a year, more than that, less than that?
More than that. But it seems, like you said, it seems to come kind of in waves. There was maybe a month where I hadn't heard from anyone, and then a week, literally, I heard from 4 people.
Gotcha.
So I'm not sure if things just came back on some creditor's radar or what the situation was.
Well, I know it's very common for creditors to sell their old accounts, and I'm not going to mention names on this podcast because I don't need to be sued over all this, but I know that there's a collection agency in particular that has been in effect buying up old accounts. So the cell phone company, here's all our accounts for the last 10 years that we haven't been able to collect. And in some cases, they're actually fairly big numbers. I was looking at one this morning that was $10,000. So I'm pretty sure the cell phone bill probably only started off as $1,000 or $2,000, but you add interest for 10 years, it becomes a really big number. So now the collection agency's got a hold of it. They're now pursuing the person. Well, they may be pursuing you in the U.S. or wherever you are. That may be the reason why the calls come in waves. It's like, yep, all of a sudden they've bought all these old accounts and now they're coming. So that could happen. Okay, so we've talked about the scenario where I have Canadian debts. I'm a Canadian. I'm now living in the U.S. I'd like to deal with my Canadian debts through a bankruptcy or proposal. Now, in the story you just told, this particular person has been in the U.S. for a number of years, so there is the possibility that she has also incurred debt in the U.S.
Right.
Is it possible, or how do you handle that? I've got debt in both Canada and the U.S. So if I go bankrupt in Canada, does it deal with my U.S. debts?
Yes and no. If you were in Canada,
yes and no.
Yeah, that's a problem.
Okay, that's a good answer.
So yes, in Canada, if you were living in Canada, had assets in Canada, the U.S. creditors cannot pursue you in Canada. But if you have assets and income in the U.S., the U.S. creditors can still pursue you there. So yes, you probably have to file bankruptcy both in Canada to deal with your Canadian debts and in the U.S. to deal with your U.S. debts.
If I have them in both places. So, okay, so I've got a couple of Visa cards in both places. I can't pay any of them. I go bankrupt in Canada. Would I list both my Canadian and U.S. credit cards on the paperwork?
Yes, you would.
But the U.S. creditors are going to go, well, we don't care. It's Canada. It's like a whole different
exactly
country.
It.
You know,
Yep.
we don't care. And vice versa, it's the same.
Yep.
I list my, on my Canadian bankruptcy, I list my U.S. debts. On my U.S. debts, I list my Canadian debts. The other country doesn't care. We don't care. It's not our department. All we care about is our stuff. So even if it's a Visa in both locations, doesn't matter. A totally separate thing. So I go bankrupt in Canada. We notify the people I owe money to in the U.S., but they don't care.
Right.
So if I'm living in the U.S., they could still do whatever they do in the U.S. Phone me, take me to court, sue me, whatever.
Correct.
For the U.S. debts. So that's why it may be necessary to do a U.S. filing as well.
Correct. Yes.
And have you ever seen that happen?
A few times I have.
The U.S. system is completely different than the Canadian system. We're not going to do a podcast on that. But in general, they have to find a lawyer in the U.S. to deal with their bankruptcy.
Right.
Is it as simple as that? Well, of course, it's more complicated than that. But in Canada, all bankruptcies and consumer proposals are done by licensed insolvency trustees. In fact, there's a rule that says you cannot be a practicing lawyer and a licensed insolvency trustee at the same time. I think that's a fantastic rule. That's awesome. In the U.S., there's no such thing as a licensed insolvency trustee. All bankruptcies are done by lawyers. And they don't have consumer proposals. They have something different. I forget what it is, Chapter 11, Chapter 13, whatever it is. I think it's called a Chapter 13 wage earner plan. So if you've got U.S. debts, find yourself a U.S. attorney, I guess
That's right.
is the short answer. Okay. So it is possible. And would you then do the filing at the same time? Like they'd come in and see you on Monday and then go see their U.S. attorney on Tuesday? Or does it matter?
I'm not sure it matters, but I mean, there has to be some kind of coordination because when you file for bankruptcy in Canada, you have to list all of your debts, regardless of where they are. and all of your assets, regardless of where they are. If you have no assets, you probably can do them simultaneously. If you have assets, then you have to do some coordination, because then it's a case of, okay, do those assets belong to your Canadian creditors? Do they belong to your U.S. creditors? Do they belong to both? So you have to work out some logistical issues with the U.S. attorney.
Well, that sounds like it gets pretty complicated.
That could get complicated.
So you're the trustee of the person in Canada, and he says, oh yeah, I own a house in Michigan.
Right.
Well, you now own a house in Michigan.
Potentially, yes.
Because assets, it doesn't matter where they are, you still want to realize on them for the benefit of the creditors. Now, of course, it's not a simple matter for you to sell someone's house in a foreign country, but in theory, that's an asset. But of course, the U.S. bankruptcy process will also say, hey, wait a minute, we have first dibs on that. So it sounds to me like that's a case where if you've got debts in both places, you're really going to have to do some coordination. You're going to have to talk to experts in both countries to sort that out.
That's right.
That does not sound like a simple matter. The vast majority of people you're dealing with, though, do not have millions of dollars in assets. That's the whole reason that they've got some financial difficulty.
Exactly.
Okay, excellent. So any final advice you'd like to give us? Any final words, for someone who's listening to this who has, is living in the U.S. and has Canadian debts? What's your overall advice?
I mean, the best case situation would be that if you're planning on severing your ties with one country, moving to the other, try to leave debt free or as minimal debt as possible that you can deal with it if something negative happens. And we talk about this, it's always on your podcast, having a plan to deal with unexpected circumstances. So should you be moving to a foreign country when you have 50, 60,000 in debt? Maybe not. So maybe try to take care of that first, get it down to something more manageable, or at least deal with it at that time. So start making a plan with your creditors at that point before it gets to the situation where you have to look at bankruptcy or a proposal dealing with cross-border issues. It's just going to complicate everything for you.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. I got a bunch of debt. Well, why not deal with it now before I move? Because it's very rare that you move on 2 days' notice.
Correct.
That's not kind of how it works. I assume there's paperwork you got to have, I don't know how that all works, right? There's paperwork, right? So there's always paperwork. So I know I've got this job offer. I'm going to be moving to the States in a few months. Great. Get a proposal up and running now.
Right.
And so if I start my proposal now and I move to the U.S., it just keeps on going, right?
Yeah, that's exactly it.
So you get the payments out of their Canadian bank account. We just set it up pre-authorized payment.
Yep.
So long as they've got a way to put money in their Canadian bank account, it's easy.
It's very easy.
Very easy. So I think that's really good advice. Get it dealt with before you move, and then it's dead simple. Now, are there any issues with crossing the border when I have debt? So if I've got a bunch of debt and I just move to the States, and then I come back to visit my relatives here, are they going to stop me at the border because I got all this debt?
You'd be surprised the number of people that actually ask me that question.
Oh, I know. I get asked it all the time.
And no, there's no concern about being stopped at the border because you owe credit card debt or lines of credit.
And now why is that? Because I know with the new cannabis legislation that we've got coming in, there was something in the news back in, I don't know when it was, August or September, that said that some U.S. border guard was interviewed and he said, oh yeah, if you're an investor in cannabis companies, we're not going to let you into the U.S. That was the quote. How they would know you're an investor, I don't know, but that was a thing. So when the border guard is checking, and you cross the border all the time, right? They're not calling up your credit report.
They're not calling up your credit report. They're calling up your passport number or your Nexus number to see what your travel habits are. They're asking you questions about what you brought back. They're not asking you about your debt.
And they can check your criminal record, I assume.
Yeah.
So if you're a murderer, then maybe there's an issue. But credit has nothing to do with it.
Nothing to do with it.
The border doesn't care if you owe the bank money or not.
Right.
So, okay, and I think you're right. And I get asked that question all the time, and I'm not in a border town. You are. And I think that's a very important thing for people to realize, that the border is looking for criminal activity. If you owe money to somebody, that's not a criminal thing. That's a business thing. You just owe money. Not a big deal at all. So that would be an argument in favor of, move, don't worry about it. But obviously we talked about all the reasons, reasons why it is a good thing to deal with. So, okay, so deal with it before you go and have a plan. That's the general advice that you've got.
That's exactly it.
Excellent. So if people have questions because they're either living in the U.S. and they've got Canadian debt, or they're living in Canada, they've got U.S. debt, or they're considering moving or something, what's the best way to get in touch with you?
They can reach us at our website, hoist.com, and then you can find a link there to how to contact me.
And it's Rebecca Martin, Martyn.
That's right, with a Y. Martin with a Y.
Don't spell it with an I. That's not good. So, excellent. Well, I think that's a great way to end it. Rebecca, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
That's our show for today, as always. Show notes with links to everything we discussed today and a full transcript can be found at hoyes.com. That's HOYES.com. And as Rebecca just said, if you've got questions about American and Canadian debts, you can contact Rebecca to ask her questions through the links at hoyes.com. And I'll even put links in the show notes to Rebecca's Twitter feed if you want to follow her there. I've got lots more great guests coming up, so don't miss an episode. Subscribe to the audio version of Debt Free in 30 on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts, and the video version can be found on our Debt Free in 30 YouTube channel. So, until next week, thanks for listening. I'm Doug Hoyes. That was Debt Free in 30.